Okay, good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukie Planning Commission. Agendas, additional copies of staff reports are available on the table in the hall, and if you haven't picked up an agenda, please do so, containing important information about the process, and if you wish to be included in the mailing list for a decision, please add your name and contact information to the sign-up list located in the table in the hallway. If you wish to testify, please fill out a yellow comment card, and I do understand we've already got some comment cards filled out. We will follow basic format lists in the back of the agenda, and we'll talk about continuance of the hearing tonight. So there are no minutes to approve on the agenda, so the next item would be information items.
I just wanted to remind everybody that we are not having a meeting on the 26th. I think you all probably remembered that, but for the audience. So our next meeting will be in January. I think it is January 9th.
Great. Okay. And our next item would be audience participation, which is an opportunity for the public to comment on any item not on tonight's agenda. I don't believe I see anybody who will be speaking to something else. So we will, the next item is to continue the public hearing. The public hearing on file ZA 2017-003, CPA-2017-002 is called to order. The purpose of the hearing is to consider the applications for the North Milwaukie Industrial Area Code and Comprehensive Plan amendments. This is the second hearing. The commission initiated this hearing. Remind me, that would be November 28th. Thank you. And is continued to tonight, December 12th. We are in deliberation phase of the hearing, meaning both the record and public testimony are closed.
That's not it.
That's right. The hearing is still open.
Yeah.
We are reopening testimony, correct? Sorry, I misread my script. Okay. So I can go ahead and recite rules on conduct for commissioners, correct? Before we begin, I'd like to give each commissioner the opportunity to state their intent to participate or abstain from the hearing. Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to abstain?
No.
Does any member wish to declare an actual or potential conflict of interest?
No.
Okay. Does any member wish to report on any ex parte contacts?
No.
No from me. Does anyone have any rebuttal to the ex parte contacts declared by commissioners? We had none, so. Will any, we don't need to read that part either. Visiting the site. Actually, I guess we could.
We should.
All right. Will any commissioner who has visited the site prior to the hearing please raise their hand? Okay. And did you who visited the site since the last hearing speak to anybody of note or note anything different than what's indicated in staff report?
No.
Okay. Has any commissioners that missed the previous hearing reviewed the material from the hearing and is prepared to participate?
Yes.
Okay. And does any member of the audience wish to challenge the participation of any member of the Planning Commission? Thank you. Before we resume the commission deliberations, I want to open the record so staff can present new information requested at the last hearing. Is that proper? All right.
Okay. Good evening, Chair. And members of the Commission. Vera Collier, Staff Planner with the Planning Department. Here to present the second part of the Code Amendment package. Again, tonight's hearing is focused mainly on the zoning code portion of the amendment package. The November 28th hearing was focused on the comprehensive plan and sort of the policy language piece of the Code Amendment package. What we were hoping...
Hold the mic a little bit closer.
Okay. I'll just sit closer. Officer. Part of the, what we'd like to discuss as far as the process tonight is have the staff go through a presentation, take any testimony from folks in the audience, and then go back through the key questions that we've identified in the staff report and in the presentation, if that's okay with you, through the chair.
Okay.
All right. Again, for folks that might not be familiar with the project goal for this code amendment package is to implement the NMIA framework plan and implementation strategy. The North Milwaukie industrial area, again, is the northern area just north of downtown. You see that in the bottom part of the screen here. It's approximately 200 acres of industrial manufactured zoned land right now, and was the subject of the North Milwaukie industrial area framework and implementation strategy that took place over the past year. The plan itself was adopted by City Council in July of this past summer, and staff was given the direction to implement the plan through a code and plan amendment package. Okay. Now, as far as the code amendments go, this slide summarizes the code amendments, and we'll get into some more detail as we go. But overall, we are proposing to reduce the total number of zones that are in the North Milwaukie industrial area from 5 to 2. More specifically, combine the manufacturing zone and the Tacoma Station area zone sub-area 4 into areas that we're proposing to call the North Milwaukie Employment Zone, the NME. Because you can't have a plan without having acronyms. We also propose to combine the Tacoma Station area overlay zone sub-areas 1, 2, and 3 into a single Tacoma Station area mixed-use zone. We're proposing to delete the Tacoma Station area overlay zone that exists in the code right now. And then we're also proposing code language overall that's organized in a way that is more consistent with the commercial mixed-use zone. So we're relying on tables and less text than the existing code has right now, so that we're taking the advantage of the ability to make it more streamlined and more easier to read and follow for folks that are using the code. In this graphic, you can see on the left the current zoning, and again, up in the northern area, you see MTSA sub-areas 1, 2, and 3. You see sub-area 4 just south of that, and then in the purple areas, that is the manufacturing zone that applies to a portion of the eastern part of the area, and then the entire western part, and by that I mean west of McLaughlin Boulevard. On the right is a graphic showing the proposed zoning. Again, the MUTSA, or the mixed-use area to the north. Again, the combination of sub-areas 1, 2, and 3. And then all in purple is what we're calling the North Milwaukie Employment Zone, which is a combination of MTSA sub-area 4 and the M manufacturing zone as it is represented in the NMIA. What you also see on the right is under consideration is this North Milwaukie mixed-use overlay that was discussed last time, as well as in a couple of the work sessions. And so that is an area that's been identified as having an overlay zone, and we'll get into some more detail on that in the key questions. But again, that it would be an overlay on top of the North Milwaukie Employment Zone. So the NME industrial zone would be the base zone, and then have an overlay that would allow some of the mixed use components in it as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. In the key questions, staff has in the staff report, we've identified 7 key questions that we'd like direction from the Planning Commission as we finalize and tweak the final code language for the next hearing on January 9th. The first one is we're asking, does the Commission agree that marijuana production uses, and by that we mean grow facilities, should be permitted as a conditional use in the NMIA? And we ask this question because the existing code allows production uses as outright permitted uses in the M zone and as conditional uses in the MTSA zone. So because we're combining these zones, we've proposed that the language makes marijuana production as a conditional use in both the MUTSA, the mixed use area to the north, as well as the NME zone, so that throughout it would be a conditional use. And we want to make sure that the Commission, first of all, that you're aware of that we that we made that change, and if you agree with this change or if that's something that we should talk about. And again, maybe I can just go through the key questions and we can circle back and go over one by one. Okay. The second key question is asking about how the code should address maximum street setbacks. Setbacks affect the relationship of a building to the street. With smaller setbacks, you create a more urban pedestrian feel, so you have buildings that are required to be closer to the street, but that also eliminates or reduces the ability for a site to provide parking near the street or in that area between the building and the street. That can include ADA accessible parking at the front or at the entrance of the building, so it's something to think about. There's pros and cons to this idea. One way to address this idea is to allow for a larger street setback, but limit the amount of parking that could be between the building and the street, and require that remaining area to be landscaped, as an example. That would address minimum site landscaping requirements outside of the off-street parking landscaping that's required in parking lots. So there's some push-pull here that we're talking about. Should we allow parking between the building and the street? How do we address the idea of some parking being available between the building and the street? How do we address front yard landscaping? Is this something that we should be thinking about only on key streets? This idea of having buildings close to the street or to the sidewalk is an urban design feature. It's something that really creates more of a pedestrian aspect. Is that something that we think is important throughout the area or only on key streets? It sort of cross-pollinates a couple of different issues within the code, so we wanted to bring that up and see how what the commission thinks about that. And we've got a couple of graphics here. You see here, this is an image of, this is the property at 2200 Milwaukie. So it's Main Street is to the right with McLaughlin, and then this is Milwaukie to the left, running east-west. So the next couple of photos compare two corner properties right on Main Street, and we've identified Main Street as one of the key streets in the area. This one has parking in the street side yard and the front yard, so all the parking for this building is right off of the sidewalk. So it's just against the building, perpendicular against the building, but the setback is really small. So vehicles have to back right into the street. So there's no room. It's basically as wide or as the parking space itself is long. There's no landscaping, obviously, but for the corner shrub here at the corner. In the flex space overlay in the general mixed use zone in central Milwaukee, we do have a maximum front yard setback of 50 feet. And that accommodates a bay of parking and a travel lane. We don't allow that on facing 32nd because we decided that 32nd was a key street, but on back streets or other streets other than 32nd, we allowed that. Just kind of wanted to illustrate, kind of how this sort of idea of these maximum street setbacks and parking in the front yard, what that can do to a developed site. So here's an example of not a great way of handling parking between the building and the street. But then you see this property here. It's also on the corner. This is Main Street and Beta. It has the bulk of its parking and all of its loading docks on the secondary street, so on Beta. Approximately, just about 60% of the Main Street frontage has been landscaped. It has sufficient setback for a travel lane within this parking that you see here, right here on Main Street, which is the closest street to kind of where you're standing in the photograph. Only uses a portion of the setback for parking, and the rest of that is landscape. So it's another way of treating, and albeit these are corner properties, so you have that extra room sort of on that second side for parking. But it's another way of thinking about how that street-facing length could be handled when you're talking about maximum setbacks, landscaping, parking, all of those things. Again, in the flex space overlay, the maximum front yard setback is 50 feet. The setback has to be landscaped except for where it's used for parking. And so one of the things that we were thinking about, maybe there's a percentage of area that could be used for parking. The remainder had to be landscaped, that you couldn't do the whole thing, but you could use a portion of it. That was something that came up in our discussion of the code code at the DLC. We've gone to them a couple times to get some feedback from them on the design standards, and this was one of the items that they brought up at the last meeting. Maybe one thing to think about is only allowing a portion of that street setback to be used for parking, not the whole thing, but they thought it might be something to consider, actually still allowing some parking between the building and the street. And again, it could be something that's only permitted on key streets, and maybe on the other streets it doesn't matter. You know, there's some couple of different ways that we could think about that. Speaking of key streets, does the commission agree with the proposed key streets? Because the MUTSA, and this map that you see here, sorry, on the right, identifies in red the proposed key streets. Because the MUTSA is intended to be mixed use, includes both commercial, industrial, and residential uses, the pedestrian experience is critical, of course, and design standards will support that. However, the NME zone does, and likely will, function differently as a predominantly industrial area. Pedestrian safety along public streets is necessary, but we think we should be considering to what extent design standards should be imposed for buildings, for example, requiring truck traffic and loading docks. The same kinds of design standards may not necessarily apply, and may not necessarily apply to all sides or all aspects of the building. So staff is proposing to create a hierarchy of streets and applicable design standards to reflect that, to provide opportunities for truck-dependent or warehouse-type uses, for example, that maybe should not be or would not be subject to design standards, depending on where they are. And by creating a hierarchy of streets where we're actually applying those design standards, where they're going to be required, then we also create opportunity for the more truck-dependent, loading dock-dependent, less pedestrian necessary kinds of streets. So we're creating opportunities for a couple of different types of development, so that we're not identifying every street as being a pedestrian-centric or pedestrian important kind of street, that we're providing opportunity for those other types of uses to be here as well. Spoke a little bit about this when we were talking about the maximum setback requirement, but this idea of minimum site landscaping, and should we be requiring that throughout the NMIA? And if so, is there a level of redevelopment that should trigger that requirement? The existing code language requires 15% of a site to be landscaped. That is the same requirement that we see on International Way in the BI zone, in that business park kind of environment. Questions have been raised about the appropriateness of minimum landscaping in an urbanized industrial area. Certainly this area is not Central East Side, but it's not the BI zone or the International Way area either. It's somewhere kind of in the middle of that. Section 600, which is our off-street parking requirements, has minimum landscaping requirements for off-street parking areas. So to some extent, certainly parking areas are a newly developed parking area. If there were a new site development happening here in the NMIA, would be required to landscape the parking area. Perhaps it's adequate to require landscaping only in the front yard setback, if there is a setback, or if that's how development is established, to create a more appealing streetscape. And then we'll have the parking area as well. Several buildings in the NMIA already have landscaping in the front yard, and you can see a couple of examples of that here. But we're wondering if there's sort of having this overall minimum site landscaping requirement, if that's appropriate, or if that's something that we should be thinking about here. And maybe we could be relying upon the off-street parking, front yard setback kind of landscaping, and leave it at that. So it's something to think about. Question 5 is asking about some of the design standards that are being proposed. And again, a lot of these standards that we're pulling into this code language, or this new code language, is pulling from the existing MTSA code language. We're just sort of pulling it all together into one part of the document rather than in an overlay. But in particular, in this first question, we're asking about ground floor glazing. What we're proposing in the code and what we're asking is, are these design standards for for development on key streets reasonable? Do we think these are the way that we should be pursuing these? So for ground floor glazing, the code talks about an objective standard of a minimum of 30%. That a minimum of 30% of that ground floor area, which is defined in the code. So it's not the whole building, but it's what is defined as, up to 15 feet of height, so that area of that ground floor wall would need to be 30% glazing. And we have some existing buildings that do include glazing already on their street. And it does, and again, this is to create that pedestrian, kind of that relationship between the building and the pedestrian, so we don't have these blank walls, kind of like that 2200 Mail Well that we saw that has exactly no windows there at all. So this is one of the requirements that we're thinking about. And again, these are design standards that would be applicable for the street-facing walls on the key streets, not throughout the entire NMIA. An alternative, and this was something that came up in the NMI, or in our meeting with the DLC, is what if there's a situation where that 30% of glazing does not jive with the kind of business that it is. Maybe it's a warehouse. Maybe they can't use all that window. They need some actual more wall space in that ground floor. So the idea from the DLC was, well, what if they could kind of reduce the amount of glazing, but they needed to do something else, like an art mural or a green wall or something to make up for that 30%. So there's a couple of, this was fun to kind of find these examples, but pictures of how you might do a combination of glazing and some green wall to make up for a particular use not being able to accommodate all of that glazing, that there was an alternative. And again, it's not intended to replace the glazing, but that you could reduce the amount of glazing and do something else. I think these are particularly cool, and it'd be really fun to see something like this. Or combine it with some art and be able to do some art. And Sakatumi, that's an existing building that we have here in the NMIA. And it's kind of it's identifying the business, but it's done as more than just a painted sign. I mean, it is a bit more artistic, I think. And then ADX is a building that's existing in Portland as well. So and then Breakside, you see that up in the left-hand side. So there might be some ways that we could kind of provide some alternatives to just the 30% glazing. We might get some interesting applications of that in the NMIA. Flexible ground floor space is actually a new standard that staff is proposing. This standard was suggested by the DLC, and it currently applies downtown as well. The intent is to ensure that new buildings are designed and constructed with a minimum height of 14 feet on the street-facing ground floor with a minimum depth of 20 feet. And that would accommodate a variety of uses should, businesses change in and out, and provides a much taller or a somewhat taller ceiling on that first floor. And these are just some examples of what that could look like, both from the street and in the interior. And you can see that when you have higher than your standard ceiling height, you've got more flexibility in what kind of businesses could be there. Restaurants, retail, you could even have some kind of light manufacturing depending on, so you want that higher ceiling on that first floor. So we've introduced that concept here in the NMIA as well. And again, on key streets. So again, these are part of the design standards that we're proposing that would apply to development on the key streets. Now, all these design standards, again, need to be triggered by something. I mean, they don't just automatically apply to everything that's happening, and certainly not to existing development. But what are the appropriate applicable triggers for the design standards on those key streets? Is there a minimum amount of investment that should require compliance with the standards? Again, trying to recognize that the NMI plan recognizes retrofit as being kind of that first phase of development in the area that will promote a transition phase for retrofit of existing buildings. But we also want to encourage design standards that can be reasonably met for a certain level of building expansion. And we're trying to figure out what that balance is. Where's that right spot where that should tip over, basically? Building expansion, modification, site redevelopment. What is the code language that you have in your packet is pulled from our existing code and is asking about if you're modifying more than 50% of that street wall, then the street wall itself needs to comply. So now we're into glazing and doing all of these things. There's some language that we looked at both in Portland and in Lake Oswego that's even has, expansions of 300 square feet or more. Then we've got some triggers. So we're trying to figure out that right balance of when is there enough investment in a building that trips, and we want to have the whole thing comply. We want to be respectful of existing buildings, set an appropriate threshold for requiring new design standards without negatively affecting those employers. So again, kind of back to that balance. And then the final key question has to do with the overlay zone, and how would the commission like to proceed with the consideration of that overlay zone? The commission, I guess, do you have any questions about the proposed language? And it's kind of rough. We were just sort of trying to create a skeleton of the language, and it's highlighted in the code that you had in your package. The options that have been discussed by the commission is to maintain the NME and the MUTSA and not do an overlay, create a new overlay with no standalone multifamily residential and a 10-year sunset, and that kind of reflects what was discussed over the summer. And that's the language that we talked about at the last hearing on the 28th, and the kind of skeleton of that language is what was in the code that you had in your package. Or we could just apply the existing MUTSA zoning, onto it and create that overlay. But option B was the one that we think we heard at the last meeting, and kind of where we were going with in the code that you had before it. And again, this is the map that identifies kind of how that would look. The MUTSA up in the north area, the bulk of the area being the NME, and then applying that overlay zone. That would be mostly the MUTSA type of zoning, but again, no standalone residential, as we heard from the commission, and that the zone itself would sunset after 10 years. So it would provide a window of opportunity for those properties, but it's not a permanent actual zone. It's an overlay. The way we would craft that, you have the zoning language or a draft of what that language could look like. The adopting ordinance would include an effective date and a sunset clause, so the ordinance that would actually apply all the changes. And then again, the proposed code language would address the situation of an overlay that applies only to development permitted within that time frame. So that development kind of would enjoy that overlay as being its zoning, but beyond that, you'd have to have actually started the development. And I think the way we've proposed the code right now is that permits have been issued. So building permits have been issued. You've gone through that process. Land use and building development permits would have already been issued. That's how you kind of lock in the overlay itself. You had at your desks when you came in this evening a memorandum from Chuck Eaton. He's our engineering director and our floodplain manager. Provided just some material. He was given the floodplain, the engineering PowerPoint presentation that was part of the testimony at the last hearing, and he submitted a memorandum to staff to present to you as the floodplain manager, just talking about the development and as it is affected by the floodplain, specifically on the Mill End Store site, but in general how the floodplain, as he sees it, would work as far as development on that site would go. And then
I might expand on that.
Please,
Were you going to say anything else about it?
not about that, but
Okay.
please, yeah.
So what Chuck's memo basically says, it is different than the testimony that you received from Roger Sutherland. The way Chuck interprets our code is the footprint of the building represents displacement of water. So that footprint can be rebuilt within that, so in calculating if any water is displaced, his approach is that footprint is you can rebuild within that footprint. You can fill in that footprint. You can't fill beyond that footprint, but you can fill that entire footprint. That is not what Roger Sutherland said to you at the last meeting.
But you would have to fill above the floodplain.
You would have to bring you would either have to flood-proof the building, or for any residential use, you have to bring it 1 foot above the floodplain. So again, that is not what Roger Sutherland told you last time, and I believe the testimony you'll receive today may conflict with that, will disagree with what Chuck is saying. But Chuck's our floodplain administrator. He makes the call.
And then the final part of the staff presentation, again, at the last hearing, the development feasibility study was discussed, and that was prepared as part of the NMIA plan process, and again, was mentioned at the last hearing. Ian Carlton is here from Eco Northwest to summarize the study, provide some key process and takeaway information for you, and answer any questions that you may have. So I want to provide some context. I know Amy sent you the link to that study, but we wanted Ian to kind of come and be here to be able to answer any questions, but also to present it to you as well. So I'll let him do that.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Ian Carlton from Eco Northwest. We were on the team as a sub to MIG producing the industrial area plan that you've seen many times before. We contributed a number of pieces of data to that, including the market report that Vera just referenced. And over the course of our work with Denny and Vera and Amy and others, we were weighing in on the market feasibility of both new development and retrofitting the current existing structures in the area. And so I just wanted to provide an overview of what we did and what the key findings were. So essentially what we did was we analyzed the potential for tearing down all of the buildings on any given site and building new. So fresh development, ground up development, having purchased the site. And we looked at this from the perspective of a speculative developer purchasing the land from the current landowner for its market value and then proceeding with the investment. We also looked at the option of purchasing the property and moving forward with a retrofit of the property in the form of makerspace or an upgrade to the existing use, for example, warehouse or light manufacturing. And in all these cases, our approach to it was from the perspective of a developer making a rational investment. So seeking a return for their investors, would they proceed, and what form of profit would they potentially reap, or what form of subsidy would be required to attract them to invest in the area. So the conclusion, either they would reap exceptional profits or they would seek subsidy to be able to pay their investors, came from the same analysis, carrying out a real estate pro forma analysis on all of the sites. We then dug a bit deeper into 4 particular sites and looked at a number of potential development options on those sites that met with the community's goals for the area. And those sites in particular, given their current function, perhaps historical resources on the site in the case of the ODOT site, and how those sites could be used in the future, whether it was economically viable to carry out vertical development. Again, that would be tearing down the sites and a developer paying to build a new site, then operate it with investors being paid a return on their investment. And in those cases, and reflecting what we found throughout the area, tearing down buildings in this area is not an economic efficient use of the current structures. We found that retrofit would be the most viable option for uses. we found that outside of the plan area goals, housing was a potential option, but it would not meet the goals of the plan area. What we took away from the North Milwaukie area was two main features of it. One is that you have an area that is exceptional in our experience. We don't often get asked to come in and do an economic development study for an area that's nearly 100% occupied. You have a thriving industrial area where the buildings are being put to their highest and best use at the moment, which is light industrial, makerspace, being used for creative spaces for the most part. The second feature of the area that struck us was the coverage of these buildings is exceptional. So the lot coverage, in other words, the amount of square feet that are occupiable on any given site is quite high for an industrial area. We tend to see industrial areas with large pads for parking, for trucks, basically for the mobility required to service a warehouse or industrial space. And in this area, you have legacy buildings that occupy, in some cases, significantly more than half of the site, meaning that to buy the land to carry out a development, you would have to displace a current owner who's using that large structure economically. You'd have to pay them enough money to go away, so to speak. So because you have these exceptional structures on the sites, it would be very difficult to ask those users to go away and then to replace these current users with something brand new. And that's how we came to the conclusion, and that's what's reflected in the market analysis, that retrofitting the current structures is probably the most likely highest and best use. Now, that doesn't mean that there might be exceptions to this, that there might be instances that we could not predict and that no one could predict, where a landowner might have a low basis. In other words, they might own a piece of property and they don't want to seek the highest return on investment from that property. We also don't know if there might be users that may see this area as an exceptional opportunity, as an exceptional location or market for their services, for their manufacturing, in which case they might be paying more than what the market might otherwise bear. In those cases, you might see, those exceptional cases, you might see redevelopment of one of these sites. And we made a recommendation that the plan should be flexible and allow for something like that to occur, that we ourselves as economists could never predict. So again, at the high level, we did an economic analysis looking at this from the perspective of developers and came to the conclusion that more than likely in the near term and the midterm, you would see retrofit of the existing buildings. You would not see vertical development in this area. If you did see any vertical development in the mid to long term, this redevelopment would either be residential with no ground floor uses. So I think of an apartment building with surface parked, no ground floor retail, no services or amenities, which was not in keeping with the plan. Or in the long term, you might also, or mid and long term, you might see some of these sort of exceptional projects where the stars align with a property owner interested in redeveloping and not taking a full return on investment, a user coming in seeking this site for some reason that we can't predict. So glad to answer any questions that you might have about how we went about it and our conclusions.
I have a couple questions. First of all, thanks for your summary of that. That was very helpful. Your preliminary assumptions on the fair market value for the properties, was that based on assumptions with current zoning or proposed zoning allowing residential?
It's based on current zoning and current economic uses, so not based on future zoning. No.
Okay. Was there any speculation or study based on future zoning allowances and how that would impact fair market value?
So the way that we carried out the analysis was that we modeled what a developer would be willing to pay for the land under future cases. So if 6-story, 20-story buildings were to be allowed on the site, what would a developer be willing to pay to purchase the site, build on the site, occupy the site, and pay their investors a return? So our analysis did consider that. What we found is that in most cases, there were not significant enough returns to investors to justify those large-scale investments. And then we took into account the fact that the developer would not be getting land for free, but that they would have to buy it. And so we compared what they'd be willing to pay to what we estimated, actually we didn't estimate, what the tax assessor estimates the value of the property would be. So in many cases, we found that developers would not be willing to build even if they were given the land for $0. And then we took into account the fact that they would actually have to pay more than $0 to purchase the land.
Okay. Did the analysis also take into account building structure types? Many of the buildings in this zone are tilt-up concrete or light gauge steel, which are difficult for redevelopment for uses other than light industrial.
So in our broad analysis, where we examined every single parcel, we used both an inexpensive and an expensive retrofit cost. We also looked at a low parking and a high parking alternative. But that wouldn't account for the very nuanced specifics of every single building. When we did the deep dives into 4 sites, we did take into account the current structures if they were present and what the retrofit costs of those might be. So in the case of the Goodwill site, it certainly needed seismic retrofitting and other retrofitting to be further occupied. In the case of the ODOT site, historic preservation was involved. So those were costs that were considered differentially in those particular circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about your statement that currently the buildings are put to their highest and best use. And so I guess I was wondering, I had thought, and I don't have it with me, but I had thought that there was a relatively low jobs per acre in this area compared to other similar zones. And so I guess I'm a little bit like, what do you mean by they're put to the highest and best use if they're not maximizing jobs per acre?
Sure. So let me clarify the economist's definition of highest use. So we're looking at it from an economic standpoint and reaping the greatest return for the property owner. This has very little to do with the number of employees that might be in the building. When we think about the economic return, we're thinking about what someone might be willing to pay to occupy the space compared to the cost of delivering the occupiable space. So there are some uses that are incredibly valuable uses where people are willing to pay a lot of money, where there are hardly any people inside the building. So examples, I'm going to use an extreme example, so pardon me, but Amazon operates facilities that have robots carrying out the work instead of workers, yet they are willing to pay a price premium to occupy space close to population centers. So in that case, the highest use on the site may be a warehouse serviced by robots with 0 jobs in the warehouse. Well, there would be plenty of jobs, but with a relatively low number of jobs per acre. Jobs per acre relates to what the job types, what the industries are that are located inside. And I think you've seen how some employers in this area have come to the area and they've brought a higher proportion of workers per acre to the area because they're doing light manufacturing, they're doing piecework that requires more bodies. But oftentimes the highest and best use would be something that may be even more valuable than that takes fewer people to carry out the work. Does that answer your
Interesting.
question.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I just want to close out the presentation if I could. That staff is asking for some consensus and some direction on the code amendments so that we can prepare package of language for you for the next hearing on January 9th. And just letting you know that staff will be with council at a work session next week, hoping for, well, we are having a third hearing. Possibly that would be a vote of a recommendation from the commission to council. We have another work session with the council after that, and then we're anticipating, again, a series of 3 hearings with council, hopefully with adoption in early March. So that does conclude the staff presentation. So happy to answer any questions or move to testimony or whatever you'd like, Chair.
Commissioners have any questions?
So we don't expect any direction from the council at the work sessions. We are just going to give them, update them, tell them what's in the proposal, where we are in the process. So that is not intended to be any kind of interactive discussion, more an update. So, because there's a lot of material to get through, we wanted to start that process. The other thing that I just want to reiterate, that Vera is ready to go back through all of those questions after you take testimony. So take the testimony and we'll restart the show and go through each of the questions.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and just do a reminder reading of conduct of hearing. I'll recognize those persons who've completed testimony cards, given them to me. When you come to the podium, please state your name, address for the record, so they may be entered into the minutes. Please remember, confine your remarks to the application and relevant criteria to avoid repetition, irrelevant information, and if additional documents or evidence are provided by any party, the commission may, if requested, allow a continuance or leave the record open to allow the parties a reasonable opportunity to respond. Any such continuance or extension shall be subject to the limitations of the 120-day rule unless the continuance or extension is requested or agreed to by the applicant. So I have here 3 cards in support of the application, and I'm doing a final read. I don't see anyone else who is in attendance or who has supplied otherwise. So I've been giving them in a certain order, so I'm going to call you up in that order. The first applicant, also, I'm not going to keep we don't have the clock out. I'm just going to ask, if it's 5 minutes and you're still speaking, I may try to do one of these or something. Okay, Mr. Hovey.
Yes, good evening. My name is Eric Hovey, 2408 Main Street, Vancouver. And I wanted to speak in support of the overlay, but do it in reference really to the work that was brought up at the last Planning Commission meeting, and that is related to the Echo Northwest report. I think Ian has done a good job of obviously describing their own work, especially in terms of the overview. I wanted to focus in specifically on what it says about the Millen store, because I think it's really right on point, although I think it actually may be, despite its somewhat grim conclusions, may actually be overly optimistic, because at least from my reading, it doesn't directly address the additional issues and cost related to being in the floodplain. So it's noteworthy that as was mentioned, that basically in the sites that were looked at, including this one, there was the option of basically scraping the site and doing a multi-story office. And my understanding understanding that was really sort of modeled in a way after the New York building in Portland's northwest area. So that was, as I understand the way the example was constructed, it would be assuming a new owner purchased the land, demolished the existing building, constructed a multi-story industrial building that would have maybe about 50% true industrial use and 50% office use. And the other conclusion I think that was reached here that is relevant is that the new building like that would probably achieve slightly higher rents, not hugely different rents, but slightly higher rents than other spaces already within the NMIA area. And then the second option that I think is noteworthy was looking at the retrofit option. Again, I would posit that for this particular site, given the issues of the floodplain and recurrence of flooding, I'm not sure a retrofit is viable because at some point you have an obsolete structure that is getting flooded, and at some point it simply is not going to be viable for continued operations unless you do a retrofit that really basically flood proofs the whole building, assuming that you can do that under the code, which I know there's some question about. What I wanted to get to was kind of, again, the financial conclusions of the work that ECHO did. So as was mentioned, in the multi-story office building, you sort of get two answers. One answer is what the financial viability looks like if you don't take the land value into account. And you do have a situation here, for example, with the Mill-In store, where the owner basically has a sunk investment. So he would have the option of saying, or they would have the option of saying basically, yeah, I'm prepared just to worry about the new investment I make and get a return on that, and I'll leave the land aside. Or they could say, no, I want to be a fully rational investor, and I need to look at my complete opportunity cost, and I can't predict how that owner or any other owner would go. But with the multi-story office building, the conclusion of this example was you have about a $53 million structure. The residual value, which is basically comparing the cost to the value upon completion, is a negative $8 million. So you're $8 million underwater, meaning, yes, the owner investor can decide I'm willing to put that money into it, but I'm not going to be doing anything better than if I put my money under a mattress. And there will be some owners that might do that, but there are a lot that would not. But it gets worse if you assume that the owner says, you know, I not only want to recover the investment in the new structure, but I'd like to get some return on the land as well. And in that case, the negative value goes to about, from $8 million to $10.5 million. That's how much the structure is underwater. So if this were a normal developer doing the structure, let's say that the Mill-In store gets wiped out, that the Mill-In store goes away, another party comes in and looks at the property, that investor probably is going to want to say, I want a return on my complete investment. I'm underwater here by $10.5 million. I'm not going to do the project unless the city or somebody else comes in and pays the subsidy to make it worthwhile for me to do. Now, as I mentioned, I think that even these numbers, I want to just mention one other thing first. One of the reasons that this project has such difficult financial issues with a new development is because it's not getting the rents that a New York building is getting in Northwest Portland. I've looked at the rents for industrial space and for flex space in Milwaukie, and they're about half of what the rates are with the New York building. So your other way out of the dilemma is if you could get the rates that for industrial / office space that the New York building is getting, but that's just not happening, and that's a huge leap to say you think you're going to be able to achieve double the rents. That's kind of the going rate within the community now. And then I want to come back one last time just to the floodplain issue. Again, to my knowledge, at least the example does not talk in any way about the floodplain issue, so I'm not sure that those costs have been built in. And again, you basically have two ways of addressing the cost, or maybe just one way. One way for certain is to elevate the building, put it up on stilts, put the parking underneath. That's a huge added cost. So you've just deepened the hole. that you have to recover from financially. So you're into it now more than $10.5 million by some additional unknown amount. Now, there is the other potential option, which I know there's a technical disagreement about. I'm not a floodplain expert, so I'm not going to try to solve that question. But that is the question of, could you flood-proof the building? Floodproofing, I know because I've worked on floods that have happened for example, on the Mississippi River, and looked at viability of structures after that. I will tell you that the option of floodproofing is, while it is technically feasible, or maybe technically feasible, depending upon the codes, it is very expensive to do to make sure that it actually works. So again, you're adding some delta, some added cost, just further deepening that divide that you're going to have to do. Bottom line conclusion is the mill and store has a finite life to it. We don't know whether that life is 1 year or 20 years, because we can't predict when the next flood's going to happen and how severe it's going to be. But when there is another major flood, it very likely could be the end of that building, because it's just not going to be habitable at some point. So there will either have to be the ability to do either a substantial retrofit, which I doubt would be feasible, or more likely to have to come in and do new construction. If you're going to do new construction at that point, all of these floodplain requirements are going to be invoked, and you're either going to have to figure out, well, can I make it work with multi-story office and industrial, and based upon current economics in Milwaukee, that looks like that's a long ways away from working unless there's public subsidy. Or could I go in and somehow try to salvage the building, what remains of it, flood-proof it, and that doesn't seem to be a viable response either, assuming that you could do it. So I'd be happy to take any other questions. I just want to mention one other thing. This is somewhat similar to work that we've done in the harbor area of Portland, where it's not a flooding issue that is creating properties that are financially underwater, but it is the environmental issues of contamination of the Willamette River. And those properties have exactly the same issue, where basically there's a negative value to the land, and because there's a negative value, the property is not marketable. The best that an owner can do is just try to milk the property as long as you can and avoid the problem as long as you can of having to face up to doing something else and biting the bullet and paying that additional financial gap. In this case, I think you have an owner that thinks there is a viable alternative use with residential, and if that's possible, also keeping the mill and store, I think it's a win-win. There probably aren't many in this sort of situation that would come along, so I would certainly encourage your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from commissioners? Okay, thank you, Mr. Hovey. Next, Mr. Basinger.
Commissioners, my name is Jerry Basinger, 1006 Southeast Grand Avenue, Suite 300, Portland, Oregon. And I've asked Peter to come up at the same time, and we'll kind of co-work this. We collaborated on both the review of the staff report and of the floodplain issues. So I'll dive in. On page 17 of the staff report, is the language that staff has proposed for the North Milwaukie Employment Mixed Use Overlay Zone, and I can't say that 3 times fast.
And to be upfront, we met with staff earlier today to draft something, so this is not just out of the blue, so to speak.
So, bear with me for a second. So you should have a copy of a one-page basic suggested comments and suggestions to the mixed-use overlay zone. And I don't think I'll take the time to read through it. I'll just point out the highlights. In the applicability, that's where we get to the 10 years, and just some suggestions for language that might make that work a little bit more as intended. But we are suggesting that if an owner in that area develops or redevelops under this opportunity, so you then leave the window open that it doesn't shut off for all of the other properties. It makes sense that if you get a development that's made that investment and you get the residential in there, that it makes sense to get more. In our concept that we did earlier, we have 140 units shown as an example. I think that's very feasible. But to build community, you would essentially want to encourage other properties to redevelop in a similar manner. So if one does, you shouldn't turn off the opportunity for the other properties to do the same thing. Permitted uses, we had some discussion again with staff about the size of the existing use. The current code would allow the mill-end store to exist as a grandfathered use, but unless it was wiped out by a flood or a fire or some other disaster, we would lose that grandfathering by simply volunteering to do this development. So the next Section B essentially addresses that you should allow it to survive a redevelopment, not caused by a disaster. And then finally, the development standards, paragraph C, and that's essentially asking that the uses are allowed prior to the date of the adoption of this ordinance, would not be required to meet the development standards for this zone.
Is that it, Jerry?
Yeah.
Peter Stark, 2939 our Northwest Corner Road. A couple of points I want to add to what Jerry just commented on. First of all, the suggestion that we might allow the sunsetting to go away if there is a development was largely due to a reaction from this commission and the concern that if you're going to build some housing, you ought to have enough in the area to make it happen. So here's the interesting point. If nothing is developed, nothing is built, they don't move ahead, it goes away. If something is built, it makes sense to look at, and we talked to staff about this, maybe rewriting the zoning so that we could accommodate housing on these parcels and remove the sunsetting. So it's sort of a all or nothing. Somebody gets in and they develop housing, then it makes sense to allow the adjacent properties to do the same. The question on the permitted uses, the intent there was, it's what we pleaded the last time we were here. They really want to keep the store. And to keep the store, one way to allow that would be to write language that would give any building, not just theirs, but any building that's existing to continue to be retained, and if redeveloped, would retain the properties of that building. So in this case, it would be the mill-end store, it would be a limited amount of parking, it would be, such a certain square footage and so forth, but it's just defined by the existing use. It's not defined by zoning. And then that goes away if nothing is developed within 10 years. And then the development standards, frankly, we're not quite sure how far they go. We're not sure about I don't think any of them are bad. The window, glazing on the ground floor, all of that may be appropriate, but I think that it's kind of fuzzy until it's kind of solidified. It makes sense to maybe keep that dialogue open until I figure out what it is. So that's, staff I'm sure will want to talk about this. This is the first time they've seen it. We talked about it earlier today, and so it's just coming out for the first time. I wanted to touch on a couple of other points. First of all, I'm not an expert in flood zones. I mean, that's why we hired Roger to take a look at this thing. I had a discussion with staff earlier, and I knew that there was going to be testimony from staff that Roger was wrong, and I mean, I don't know, but I think what would be appropriate would be for Roger and Scott, is that Chuck and Chuck to get together and talk to each other, because my understanding on the phone today with Roger, and I just asked him to send this out, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit gruff, which is Roger, but I think would be appropriate would be to have Roger and Chuck talk about what's allowed. My understanding is it's not a city code per se, but city code adopted Metro, and it's the Metro code that takes precedence here. And the Metro code, according to Roger, is that the building, because it floods, is calculated as part of the floodplain, and that changed sometime in 1990 something. And again, I'm not the expert, so I'm just paraphrasing what I heard. And because of that change, they're no longer allowed to flood-proof or cut and fill or do anything. They have to elevate the building. That's the only option on the site. So we'll find out before the next hearing and have these two gentlemen talk to each other and sort out what the truth is. But the bottom line is it's a money issue regardless of what the actual decision is. The owners of mill and store cannot build unless they have some way to subsidize the cost to take care of this flooding issue. And what we've heard from previous testimony is the only real solution would be uses that pay for the additional cost to develop. And so that's really all. We're just here to say that it's the same thing again, and we want to thank the commission for twice supporting our efforts, and look forward to the next time we meet.
Thank you both. Any other questions for these gentlemen, commissioners?
Thank you.
I have two quick clarifications. If I can get my mic, stay up here. First of all, has city staff seen and responded to this? You have not? Okay. So
I literally had an hour to draft it and come back, so I apologize for that.
no, that's fine. But it was based on a conversation that happened.
We need time to look at it. I made very quick notes, and I had a lot of questions about the language.
Okay.
And I might raise a couple points. I might raise them right now. If the intent, so there's a big question here about intent. What do we want in this district? Whether it was an opportunity for some residential to happen, or whether or not it becomes a residential district. So part of the change, what we had written was if somebody doesn't take advantage, if properties don't take advantage of the residential component, it goes away. And the way it was written was it didn't eliminate the overlay, it just took that ability away to use that residential right. So, the sunset was about the right. It wasn't about the entire overlay. So, so we were saying you had to use it to it was a use it or lose it thing. It wasn't suddenly saying now everything in the district is eligible. And this language would make everything in the district eligible. You don't have to decide this today. In fact, what I'm hoping you do is talk about all those other questions that we've raised, because there's a lot here. If you, and the way we numbered them is we put this district discussion at the end because we wanted to make sure we got to some of the other things. We've talked about the district already. The other thing in here is about, and that we talked about, was how would you structure the code to allow the replacement of a very large retail use. So if they're going to redevelop the site, the code today would say, or the code as it's proposed, would limit the retail use to 20,000 square feet. So they've got a 60 plus thousand square foot retail use. So, I think the way you would write that in is to say existing retail uses are allowed. The existing retail uses and their square footage are allowed in the overlay. And that's it. So nobody else gets to come in and put in a 60,000 square foot retail use. It's a mill and store. It is a fabric store that gets to exist. And I would write it tight so that is the only use, the only retail use that gets to exist. If I were, based on the testimony that you guys had. So you're not in deliberation yet, but I'm just explaining kind of where we're at.
Right.
Go ahead.
Because what they're essentially asking you to do is they're taking something that right now would be a non-conforming use under your code because it exceeds the maximum amount of square footage, and they're saying allow the non-conforming use in a future building. And how we normally look at non-conforming uses in codes, whether it's a sign or whether it's a building or whatever it is that when that use stops, for a period of time, and different cities measured in different ways, but there's a break in the duration. At that point, it reverts back to the what will be allowed under the code, which Denny indicated is 20,000 square feet. So this would be, I certainly agree with Denny that you have to be really careful in how this would be drafted, because if you're not really careful and it's not really tight, it could open kind of a Pandora's box of unintended consequences. And I think too, beyond the retail use, one of the things that was mentioned are items like parking. And obviously Denny and I haven't had a chance to talk about this, but if there is something like a mill-end store plus apartments, if the code's written in such a way that would only require however many parking spots are there currently, maybe that will be enough for a 60,000 square foot future mill-end store, but that might not be enough depending on the scope and scale of the apartments. So again, with all these things, if you're going to take a snapshot in time and say what exists today can exist in the future in a different building, that's a policy decision for you guys to make. I just want to make sure that you fully vet the consequences and that staff have an opportunity to really craft this as tightly as possible so that whatever we end up with reflects what you want.
And what I guess I would do, I wanted to write a couple of those policy questions for you so we could talk about them eventually. And one would be, is this district about more residential or just the residential to help these few properties convert? Or is it, and then is it a limit for just the mill-end store, or is it any retail? And then the final ones would be the way the wording was. It talks about existing development or redevelopment, and redevelopment is the question. I mean, and it's like at some point, redevelopment is new development. At some point, redevelopment triggers conformance with the code. And I would have concerns about exempting everything in the district from those development standards. Because, the point of having the development standards is that redevelopment is bringing things closer. So, again, I think we really need to talk about the language that these guys developed, although I think it creates really good policy questions.
Yeah, and the intent was not to say, this is it. And also, Denny brings up other really good points. We're really only concerned about mill-end store. Some of this came through conversations we had, again, when Planning Commission said, if you're going to have housing here, don't you want it throughout the area? So we don't really care if you sunset the other areas. We're just focused on one area. And regarding, Denny mentioned the district, this would be only focused in the overlay area. We wouldn't propose it to go beyond that. So we've worked with staff. I think we're very willing to sit down and figure out what makes sense, because verbally I think we understood each other. I may not have drafted it correctly. And so I'm happy to sit down again with their staff and figure it out.
And as I said before, staff is happy to craft a proposal from the Planning Commission to take to the council. But when we get back to the council, we're probably talking about the plan that the council adopted. We're going to present this option, but we're also going to be presenting the option that matches the plan that was adopted back in September.
One additional.
September, wasn't it?
July.
Thank you.
One quick additional question that I would have about Part A is, how do you quantify substantial development or redevelopment? Is that any development or redevelopment of?
That was one of the points that I wrote too, is it one house? Is it 2 units?
Or is it retail? Is it commercial? Is it industrial, which is a permitted use that causes that sunset to go
That's why
away?
these first drafts are great, because they raise a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's just a question. So.
The other thing I would ask if these guys are done, that if Ian had any points to make in reaction to what Eric had mentioned, I think we should let him clarify what he thinks his report said.
Okay.
You guys done with us?
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Very much.
Thank you.
Would you like an opportunity to respond?
I'd be happy to answer your questions if you have them. We did model something similar to the New York building with a ground floor that's essentially open, which would allow potentially the building to conform to a floodplain condition. So we did consider the floodplain in that regard. But there's certainly, we are not experts in costing out the waterproofing of an elevator shaft, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Thank you. Point of order question. I believe the protocol is, or the rule is, I can close the hearing and then there'll be a motion to reopen it after deliberation.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. The public testimony portion of this hearing on file ZA-2017-003, CPA-2017-002, North Milwaukie Industrial Area Code and Comprehensive Plan Amendments is now closed. Is the commission ready for discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I will ask if we would like a short break, maybe 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Let's take 5.
Okay.
Thanks for catching that. I will go ahead then and call the meeting back to order and invite discussion by the commission.
Okay.
I don't have a preference of who starts. Our esteemed chair usually likes to be direct on that.
That's true.
And I'm going to be more opening the field. But can I ask, because we know we have 6 questions in front of us, do we just can we dictate that we have someone run us one question by the other, by the other, by the other? Is that okay?
Why don't I do that from here, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Okay. So the first key question had to do with marijuana production uses in the NMIA. The code that is before you has them as permitted as a conditional use throughout the NMIA, which is a change from the existing code. Currently in the M zone, they're permitted outright, and in the MTSA, they're permitted as conditional use. And we have proposed code language that has them as permitted as a conditional use throughout the zone. Do you agree with that, or do you want to change that?
I think we did ask this during the work session as well, but we just wanted to make sure.
I would agree with the conditional use.
Yes, I think
Yes.
that's where we stood, and I still am with that.
Okay.
But
Nope.
anything you would like to say?
I don't want to contradict anything I might have said last time. Conditional use is fine.
Getting some political savvy. Okay,
Try to be internally consistent at least.
that's excellent, by the way.
Yeah.
Key question 2?
Key question 2 has to do with maximum street setbacks. Now, the way the code that you had in your packet is written, we hadn't changed it from the way it had sort of gone kind of between early days and today, and establishes a maximum setback, front yard setback on key streets of 10 feet, so kind of establishing that urban street line of 10 feet, and that everywhere else it would be 20 feet. But as we were going through the code, we started thinking about this other question about, and then when we went to the DLC and started asking about, should we be thinking about allowing some flexibility in that maximum setback to permit some parking between the building and the street, as we've done in the flex space overlay in the GMU. And if we did, would the commission want to entertain some idea of, only half of that area could actually be used for parking, the remainder would need to be landscaping or some combination thereof. So that's sort of kind of where this came from. The more discussion we had about it, we thought we probably want to bring this to the commission and see where you landed on that idea.
Do we think a ratio is appropriate, given this opportunity and the scale of what may be on the site?
I would.
Yeah. I would also. Do you all agree?
Is the ratio?
Well, first, is it a ratio? And then second, do we want to suggest what we think?
Mr. Architect.
No, I defer to the street guys here.
Yeah, this is tough because you think about it in terms of what kind of use, what kind of trips are generated by the building, by the use. You can have a ratio that you think is simply reasonable to accommodate whatever range of it. If it's low employment, industrial, light industrial, or uses, you could probably, gosh.
Did the DLC have a recommendation?
Right.
Right. I was, you took the words right out of my head.
I might jump in for a sec?
Please.
The question is really about, what streets are those that need to be pedestrian-oriented or should be pedestrian-oriented, and then how do we get there?
But the trick on that is, can we deliberate? Because if I understand what Vera said, you're going to come back with a hierarchy on these proposed streets that are chosen in the map.
Well, it's there, really. I mean, those streets on the map are the ones where we didn't break it down to, either the hierarchy is pedestrian street or
not.
It's not really a great pedestrian street versus sort of a pedestrian street,
Right.
sort of
Right.
not. I mean, we could
It's degrees
we
of
could go that far.
acceptance of pedestrian amenity or
So
provision.
So no, this whole thing is open for discussion and deliberation, and this is like the one thing that hung us up the most. It's like we didn't get into this in a lot of detail during the plan development.
Right.
So what we're relying on is some of the information that was in the original Tacoma Station Area Plan. It had streets that required these pedestrian amenities along the street, and we didn't. And we actually questioned some of those, whether they're right, and then we had to take this and say, are some of the streets in the other areas, in the area to the west of the highway, appropriate? So it was like, I think it comes down to what are the streets where we'd want to see some pedestrian activity? And what we looked at when we looked at that map was, so the map, I mean, I don't remember which number the map is on your questions, but it's like we looked at those northwest, when you look at the right side on McLaughlin Boulevard and the east side of McLaughlin, those are pretty much exactly what was in the Tacoma Station Area Plan. It had Main Street and it had all the little local streets up near the station. On the west side, we've included McBroad because there was a lot of discussion about trying to make McBroad a more interesting street. And then we included 17th because it has the bike lane along it. We basically wrapped every corner so that we were trying to make sure we were creating a interesting corner. But that was the thinking that went into this. Didn't the DLC actually propose a couple more or suggest a couple more, and we didn't put them on the map?
They did. The DLC talked about frontage as a potential key street as well, given its visibility to McLaughlin.
And I kind of thought initially in our earlier version, before DLC looked at it, we'd taken some of the streets out of the area that was in the Tacoma Station Area Plan up near the station, some of those little side streets. It's like, and it's such a conflict because we are allowing warehouse uses, we're allowing manufacturing uses, yet we're also hoping for this office employment environment, this high-intensity employment environment where pedestrian amenities are important. So, this could have used a lot more discussion during the plan development process, and it somehow just got by us.
Why is there a gap in that street? Is it Ochiko?
Ochiko.
Why? What is that gap for?
On Ochiko. I'm not sure. What do you think, Vera? Why is there a gap on Ochiko?
There's certainly, the corner, 17th and Ochiko, and then McBroad and Ochiko, corner kind of idea, but could certainly wrap and use and have it be all of Ochiko. That's a weird part of the frontage there, just south or just east of the Goodwill.
And the railroad.
But the railroad's
property.
there.
But I think that's a really good question, Kim. That maybe is something
But it might have been something that, is there opportunity to, would there have been opportunity to do something there?
One of the discussions in the temporary, or the overlay too, is we talked about whether that section of Millport should have it on. And then actually when we were talking with Peter Stark today, it was like, well, does that apply to both sides of the street or just the overlay part of the street? And so there's some questions like that that come up as we look at these. When we drew those, we were thinking both sides of the street. But after that conversation today, I think maybe we need to draw it so that we show which side of the street it actually applies to. Because there might be instances where we don't want it on both sides of the street. So that's some of the thinking that's gone on. And then, and we've got this window glazing requirement and alternatives for less glazing and using green walls or art. And those were suggestions by the DLC, and we thought they were really great to add some flexibility to the district. But those are...
The key streets, are we accounting correctly for current bus routes?
The bus routes? I think the only bus route through here, if I'm not mistaken, is
33.
Main.
The
Is it
Main.
not?
Main
Yep.
and 17th.
I can look it up.
Yeah, Main and 17th, I believe.
I think that's right.
Correct. The other ones, yeah.
Yeah, 17th. That's another reason
Yeah.
to think about 17th.
Okay.
So I like the key streets, and I was thinking about using the key streets as a way to think about the other things. So then the setbacks and the landscaping would follow the key streets.
Okay.
So they would be coupled. I mean, that's in my mind how it works. Yeah, if you're looking at tactics for improved pedestrian, then couple those things. That was my suggestion.
If I may, to that point, so then so if we're talking about key streets only, and we're talking about the street setbacks, then are you saying that we should have a smaller street setback on the key streets? So that 10-foot, 20-foot, something like that?
I need to see the pictures again for that. I think I'm not
Right.
good
So,
at it. Not that.
well, so if we think about this
got a
as being a
sidewalk.
20-foot setback,
Okay.
essentially because it's the length of a parking space, roughly. So what this shows you is what a 20-foot setback would look like. However, what we would have in the code then is a prohibition on parking between the building and the street. So imagine this building with landscaping in that setback as opposed to parking. If that's what you're suggesting, that there be this smaller setback for the key streets to bring the building closer up to the street, and that setback would need to be landscaped, and essentially. So then the other question that we're asking is if we wanted to entertain a larger setback on key streets or not, so going with what you're suggesting that it's not, then if it's on other streets, do we care what that maximum street setback is? Do we care if there's parking between the building and the street? This example, I included this because one of the DLC members mentioned the idea of, well, maybe you still do allow parking between the building and the street. You have a larger setback, even on the key streets, but you have a limit on how much of it could be used for parking.
Right.
So this kind of is an example. It's not a great example, but it's sort of met what I was thinking about, and it's existing actually in the code or in the NMIA, and this is Main Street. So this is a way that we could accommodate a larger setback, allow parking, but limit it. And that could be on the
Under current code, we couldn't do either one of the things. The code today, you couldn't do either of these developments. That one would require a landscape. You could park in front, but you'd have to put a landscape strip between your parking lot and the sidewalk. And the other one, you can't do that because you can't back out under a right-of-way.
Right.
So there are many situations, probably almost every building out there has some conflict with the code.
Yeah, I don't see much glazing on that building.
But I mean, even the existing code today.
Right.
That's what I was trying to say. We end up with probably any code thing we do, we may make these nonconformities greater.
Right.
I doubt that very many things that we're doing, there might be a few things we're doing that would.
Maybe.
But,
Well, this building was built in the 50s, so I think it predates a lot of things as far as that goes.
But in those interior properties that aren't on the key streets, there might be some things that we're doing that make it easier.
Right.
In a way. If we weren't going to worry about where the parking goes.
Right. I think it's just a matter of thinking about if it's a smaller setback, there's not going to be parking. There's a larger setback, there could be, maybe just a lesser amount.
I think the ADA part is important too, or, having accessible parking spots. So I guess the thought of maybe having a ratio would be the best of both worlds, I guess. You could get some parking in there. I don't know.
I mean, if there was a landscape strip between the parking and the sidewalk, it would make it, I feel like it would make it more pedestrian friendly.
Absolutely. Sure. Yep. Agreed.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I think it is worth noting that if you start adding landscape strips and diagonal parking access and things like that, that it does push the building and potentially building entries further back from the street. So while this, I think on a building level, objectively is a more successful and more attractive building than the one previous, the actual entrance and building facade is set further back from the pedestrian right-of-way.
In that example, too, it requires, that's a one-way lane through there. So that requires that they have two driveways onto the street.
Right.
I don't think we have any collector-level streets here, but I'm not, maybe Main Street is, I'm not sure. But that's another factor that goes into here. When you're doing a one-way kind of thing, you might be in a situation where you got to exit on a different street.
I mean, this is something that's permitted. They don't have to do it this way. I mean, they could certainly, this is a maximum setback, it's not a minimum. So, they could still bring the building up close like these ones are and then have parking, behind or, somewhere else. It's an option.
Well, no, it's a, I thought what we were talking about, we would allow somebody to build up to the street.
Right.
There's nothing preventing anybody from building right up to the street, depending on whether we want to put landscaping along there.
Right.
This is what we're talking about here is a maximum setback that would be a requirement. It's not a voluntary thing. It's saying you got to bring your building closer to the street on one of these pedestrian key streets. So is it within 20 feet? Is it within 50 feet? Is it?
Right. Well, if on the key streets, if we want to permit parking like this in some ratio, then the maximum setback would need to be 50 feet.
That's an option.
Like that.
Yeah.
Right.
It's probably more like, have to think about what that, if you wanted to do that design, maybe it's 50 feet, because you'd still have to have a landscape strip.
Right.
Scott may be able to rattle that off, what that distance is there, but I can't do it.
50 feet seems like such a big number. What's the point of having a maximum at that point? It's like we're kind of...
Well, it would only allow one bay of parking and a travel lane. If it gets bigger than that, then you could do a whole parking lot.
See.
Yeah. I mean...
If you had enough room.
So anyway, that's the question is, on these key streets, how much flexibility are we building in. That doesn't provide, it might provide for a manufacturing use. It doesn't help for any kind of warehouse, wholesale, anything else. It might work for small offices. It might work for other things, but it's definitely not accommodating the big warehouse kind of use or big manufacturing use that needs some loading docks and other types of things. They'd have to have some other system for getting their trucks in.
Well, and those, are they on the key streets, though?
Somebody could do it.
Retrofit something.
On a key street, but they'd probably have to back it in they'd probably have to get that access from some other location, or they'd have to have a big enough parcel that they could drive onto the parcel and put that loading dock in the back. But they're not going to have the loading dock on the key street for the most part.
Right. Like OLCC is on faces frontage street, of course.
Right.
Not a key street, but if pretend it was for a second, all of that's their only access because they don't have a rear because that's where Johnson Creek is. So
did we build in a frontage occupancy?
We did not.
So the frontage occupancy is something we put downtown, where for every parcel, the building has to occupy a certain percentage of that frontage. So, you can, and since we didn't do that in here, so if your setback was, if you had like a minimum setback of 10 feet, part of the building would have to be up to the street, but the rest of it could be, so you could have a big parking lot going back and access the side of the building. So it'd be a portion of the building would be up on the street, but there's no requirement that 50% of the frontage be occupied by a building. Follow what I'm saying? I could draw it if anybody's having trouble.
So Denny, what you're saying is if you pulled up, I'll say the warehouse portion that's beyond, so there's the glazed portion and then it actually looks like it sets back further and goes to the...
So
if you pulled that to the street...
Yeah. If that driveway there went back past the glazed portion of the building, that could be the access into the warehouse, which could be at the side of the building. So this example isn't particularly good because you can obviously see that there isn't that the frontage is pretty well filled. But well, let's just say up above. I was looking at the lower one. So there, if this entire thing we're looking at there is the frontage for that glazed building, half of that frontage is occupied by a parking lot that would provide loading docks off to the side. So is that how pedestrian oriented is that? Not very, but that's something we didn't build into those key streets that perhaps if we're gonna bother to have a minimum setback, we maybe should also be talking about some sort of minimum frontage occupancy as well. I would think anything over 50% may be too much in an industrial district, but...
Yeah. City of Gresham has a 50% frontage occupancy requirement for primary arterials. So we're working on a project on Burnside right now where, similar to this, you have a very long site and are retrofitting a more contemporary commercial use, and we can't meet that 50% requirement, and they have a variance process to go through a design review and approve alternates. But it, for what it's worth, seems to be a well-written code that would be worth looking at.
Yeah. I mean, if our objective is to enhance the pedestrian environment, you got to think about all these different parts and how they fit together. And it's tough to think about mixing a pedestrian environment with a industrial district that allows trucking. It's just, these things are at odds.
Get in our southeast.
What she said.
But I think that's why in the example of OLCC, I mean, that's probably why it's not a good idea to make frontage a key street.
Yeah.
Because we
There are
know.
no options on that.
Right.
There isn't, anything back there. Right. Agreed. And that came up at the DLC meeting, there was more discussion about it. It was one of those streets that, you see it the entire way. It's almost like a gateway coming into the city. So it made sense to bring it up, and then we talked through it a bit more. Okay. In general, though, are these key streets?
In general,
make sense?
yes.
Yeah.
I believe
Okay.
that these are the right things to call out.
Okay. We'll clarify which side of the street makes sense, in those areas,
Yeah.
in case, so there isn't any confusion.
And let's look at Ochoco.
And Ochoco,
again,
yep.
All of Ochoco.
Yep. Side of the street. Okay. All right. Halfway. That's
Okay.
great. Okay. Minimum site landscaping. Again, the code requires right now 15%. And that includes, all landscaping. Our off-street parking requirements already have, if you were building a new parking lot, or if you were there are some triggers within in Chapter 600 that ask for bringing a parking area closer into conformance. For small changes of use and so on, it's typically a bike rack or striping, or there's sort of a hierarchy of things, and landscaping eventually makes the list, but there are other things that the code calls out first to do. But overall, 15% landscaping is what the code recommendation, or the code language right now that you're looking at has. It's what the existing code has. It's what the BI zone has. It's sort of our standard manufacturing zone landscaping. And because a question had been raised, does that make sense? Do we want to keep with that?
I think
Want to bring that up? Yeah.
We're not fully an urban district like Central East Side in Portland, and we're not a suburban district like our BI zone, which is sort of office park. We're somewhere in between, or some weird combination of that. Some of the blocks, as Ian had pointed, are almost fully developed with buildings, and other places have this landscape environment. And it's sort of, as we see this area redevelop, what do we want to move towards? Is it full lot coverage and allowing for maximum lot coverage, or is there some character element that we ought to be going for with landscaping?
Does the landscaped area refer to specifically designed and planted areas, or can along Johnson Creek, the WQR HCA areas meet the 15% landscaping
That would be
requirement?
considered part of it.
And
Yes.
Part of it.
And as an eco district, what's our
That's really-
purpose here? I mean, the eco
When we looked
district.
at the mini storage unit, and we found out that the creek setback met the landscape area, that was really frustrating to me. And it seems to me that the creek should be protected in and of itself and not be used to meet another requirement. And so if we have an opportunity to influence that, I would think that if we're going to have a landscaping requirement, it should be in addition to the WQR.
Yeah, and
Agree.
I don't think lawns are really something that you're normally going to see in an eco district, right? So,
No. Green.
but you might see a lot of native
or
plants.
something. Plantings. Okay.
So I think I'm hearing we do want a minimum landscape.
I would, maybe say if there's eco roofs, that would be offset the landscaping requirement as a way to get more dense coverage,
Yeah.
but offset it with
Like
less
that
impervious
idea as
surface.
incentive, yes.
Okay. And that the 15% is exclusive of any WQR or HCA that might exist on
Existing
the site?
habitat
Okay,
overlay.
yep. All right.
The second clause of the question,
Yeah.
level of development, is the way to frame that, basically so whatever is being applied for is a major altering of a structure,
Right. That's,
a moving of a structure, or removal or replacement of facade, or something to that level. Do we think we have a consensus of what we consider a level of redevelopment?
Did you have another question about redevelopment, or was this it?
well, so because landscaping, the way the code is organized that you have in front of you, landscaping is not considered exclusive to key streets. It's throughout the area, which you can certainly change if you'd like. But right now, it's intended to apply throughout.
Okay.
So maybe that's the first question. Should it? Should minimum site landscaping apply throughout the district, or should it only apply on those sites that are on key streets? Key streets only have to do really with that street-facing facade, as opposed to the site landscaping, which kind of would encompass the whole thing, which is why it was organized in this set of code language, that it's actually throughout the district that it would apply. So if we think it should apply everywhere, just for sake of argument, then...
Would that be a green element, though? I mean, trying to create stormwater, some facility for capturing stormwater throughout, if we did it elsewhere? I mean, that might be one way to look at it.
Sure.
Reclamation.
Right. So then, in thinking about when a site is redeveloping, or if they're just doing work on a facade, is it reasonable to expect the site itself now to suddenly have landscaping? I mean, what if it's a fully built-out site?
Right.
Where would that landscaping be accomplished, other than potentially on the roof, as an example? And is that something that, a facade is being replaced, or, a portion of a wall is being retrofitted, or something like that? Is it reasonable to expect now a green roof to happen on the building, as an example? We're trying to just figure out.
Are there existing redevelopment thresholds elsewhere in the code that we can reference rather than defining something new?
Well, there are when it comes to the design standards. But this is a site standard, which feels different because you're affecting, how much building is potentially on a site. But the thresholds that we have right now for applicability of the design standards, glazing and those sorts of building standards, demolition or replacement of more than 50% of the surface area of the roof or a wall, floor area additions that exceed 300 square feet. So it's considered major exterior alterations to the building, means that the building or that facade needs to meet that design standard for the street-facing facade. That feels like a clearer nexus because it's a building to a building kind of thing. The site landscaping is the part that, we were talking about, trying to figure out how to when do we get to do that? When do we get to ask for that landscape?
So if somebody was making improvements to a facade, or minor improvements, minor entry expansion or something, there's nothing in that kind of improvement that might trigger these types of site improvements, and whether or not we wanted to get at that, or whether or not it really requires redevelopment of the property in order to trigger some of these things.
Yeah.
Or redevelopment of your parking lot. I mean, that's the other way we can get at it, is through parking lot reconfiguration, those types of things.
Yep.
So would this be lumped in with other non-conforming site upgrades, or is this specifically pertaining to landscaping?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
So if upgrades are required, non-conforming upgrades, if the site is in non-conformance and there is a major renovation or redevelopment, just thinking about how City of Portland structures theirs, there's a dollar threshold, and if you exceed that dollar threshold, then you have to do non-conforming upgrades up to a percentage of your construction cost. And that can include what you're saying of things like bike parking, ADA upgrades, landscaping, facade improvements, things like that.
Okay.
Is there code a percentage of the building value, or is it an absolute number? Or?
It's an absolute hard number with caveats.
Okay.
So it's a non-absolute.
We haven't looked at it. Maybe we should look at theirs and try to come back with
just
something for you guys.
The original comment about like 300 square feet or a certain square footage amount gives me a little heartburn, because 300 square feet in an industrial use is a loading dock, but in an office, that can be a $500,000 renovation with seismic upgrades, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's high volatility in what you can do with that. And I think that setting a square footage requirement or even a percentage of wall or percentage of roof may put an undue burden on smaller properties rather than larger properties, whereas a large property can get away with 49 or 45% of reconstruction that a small building cannot.
Okay. No, we'll look at Portland's code then and come back. That's a great suggestion. Okay. All right. To be continued on that one then. All right. Now the design standards, and again, these were proposed to apply to street-facing facades on key streets. Ground floor glazing, 30% is what we're proposing, or an alternative 20% glazing with the remaining being the green wall art mural as an alternative, so that we had an objective standard. We kind of didn't want to tread into a discretionary something, kind of this idea of having a number. We like that idea. So thoughts on the standards?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I like that idea.
Yeah, like applying a bone or an alternative for the glazing for green wall. I do.
Yeah.
Sure.
Does that work? Okay. Yeah. All right.
Seems reasonable.
Great.
Consensus.
Terrific. All right. And just so you know, the standards, we pulled those from the existing overlay. Actually, the existing overlay requires 50%. So we actually brought it down, understanding kind of the mix of uses that we're imagining are going to be happening here. So, okay. I really want somebody to do a green wall. I just want to
Me too.
For
keep
sure.
that image up here in
Yeah,
case somebody gets an idea.
It would change the experience of a commuter going through the
Wouldn't it?
corridor.
Yeah.
It really would.
Agreed. Yeah.
It's apparent.
Or the art. Okay. This is a new one, a new standard for this district. Again, it does exist downtown, but requiring a flexible ground floor space on that first floor, 14-foot ceiling height for 20-foot depth along the street-facing ground floor for the key streets. Again, trying to make sure that we have some flexibility in how those spaces could be reused. And again, this is predominantly for, major redevelopment or new construction. It's not if you have an existing building, but that's where we'll get into that kind of what triggers that major renovation. But we would imagine this more than likely applied to new construction or something really, really pretty.
So not a retrofit.
This would, it would not a retrofit would have to be dealing with a bulk of the building. To be raising ceilings and to really significantly altering what that first floor looks like. Yeah. That's not how we were thinking about it. That something's smaller, certainly not a smaller project or anything like that. This would be a big deal structurally to deal with those ceiling heights.
I like it.
Good?
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. again, triggers, we'll get to that. We'll come back on what level of redevelopment, amount of investment, and so on. We'll come back to that one and have a better answer for you for the next meeting. So we'll punt that one as well. All right, and now we'll come to the last key question, to the overlay.
And I think we've got
Any
a
thoughts?
couple of other questions to add into this, which were the ones that were raised by the proposal.
Right.
Can I ask a question about the flex space overlay that's referenced? Does that overlay have a sunset?
It does not.
It does not, okay.
No. It applies to a good chunk of the Murphy site in central Milwaukee, at 32nd and Harrison, that large 7-acre site kind of in the back. Right. But it was drafted as a kind of as a permanent overlay on that site, yeah. And it's sort of the opposite of this overlay in that it's an overlay that allows light industrial, some of those more manufacturing uses in that area.
Let me kind of reiterate what the sunset provision here. In that the way I was thinking about this and whether I got the writing right or not when I was playing around with this was that the overlay will not go away. It's the right to use the use provision that goes away. So, because if we do have some properties that convert, we want them to continue to be, or are used residentially.
Right.
We want them to continue to be a use by right. We don't want it to go away. So it's just a way to think about this. It wasn't totally eliminating it. It was just removing part of it or making it only eligible for a certain amount of time.
So what you're saying is, so say in year 9 or something, it redevelops and has residential component, well, that would only be good for 1 year, and then it would go away? Is that, that's what we don't want to do? That's what, right.
Eligibility to take advantage of that provision is what goes away.
Right.
But your use on the use is still a permitted use.
Right, yes.
Right. So, I don't know. There's a lot of different ways you can structure something like this, but that's the way I was thinking about it. Like, so, and the other thing that wouldn't do is it wouldn't require us to correct our maps afterwards. Maps are the maps. You know, it wouldn't automatically change the map when it goes away. So, it was partly I was thinking about the logistics of making it happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Been around too long. So, what were your questions before I stole the discussion?
So I think just wanting to confirm the direction that we would be moving forward with this as an overlay that does not allow standalone residential and has a sunset, however we write that, but that it sunsets in 10 years, that's how we want to do that. Okay.
And we hadn't really talked about the MUTSA being the standards that would apply then, and we thought that was a simple way of trying to deal with this, as opposed to developing the specialized set of standards here.
Yeah. That makes sense.
It seemed like, but for the standalone residential, it encompassed all of the things that we were looking to do. So, okay.
So, are we ready for the policy questions that were raised tonight?
I would think so.
Well, I was, I think I disagree with the concept to extend the sunset. I mean, I think that we want to, allow it for a certain period of time, and then even if a property does take advantage of it, I mean, that's great for them, but ends at a certain time. It doesn't continue to open the door or allow it. So I like the sunset for it, and I disagree with the testimony about, continuing to have the sunset in place. Or to permit it.
Utilize the provisions beyond the sunset date.
Thank you. That's well said.
Oh, I think I concur with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Are you saying you don't agree with
I'm a little bit split on this, and I would argue that in agreeance with the testimony that we heard tonight, that if we want housing there, we want it to be done well and we want it to be successful. And I do think that, and to John's point, I may be changing what I've said in past hearings, but I do think that if there is proof of concept that develops over a 5-year or 7-year period, which is kind of the development life cycle of a project, that 10-year sunset makes replicability more challenging. And if there is one target site that has it predetermined that they are going to develop multifamily or mixed use or whatever there, and then their markers for success aren't evaluated or established until 7 years speculatively, then it makes it difficult to create the benefit of the MUTSA zone that we would want. And so I'm not necessarily saying that we should do away with the 10-year and just let it be MUTSA indefinitely. But if the goal is to get the benefit of that into this area, then I think that this is at least getting at a somewhat successful language to create that zone is what we wanted.
So, 10 years is a ways out there, but time flies. So, and I don't know how likely it is that we would be looking at it again that quickly. It's possible, though. We're always kind of reevaluating our codes and what's going on. So, we could build in a trigger to kind of make us look at it, and the sunset kind of does that in a way. It kind of says, "Ooh, is this really what you want?" So the difficulty is whenever we do a code amendment or a change, we do have to address statewide planning goals and go through all that trouble. So it's just one thing to think about. But I think your point's a really good one. What do we want this little district to be?
Right.
And is this a mechanism to try to help those few lots that are affected by the floodplain, or is it a conscious effort to create a little residential neighborhood?
Right. And I think that the testimony by Mr. Carlton was very good about the economic analysis for the zone, that in a little sense it sort of seemingly contradicted what I originally thought, that if this was allowed to be residential, that it would explode as a residential zone. But correct me if I'm wrong, his analysis seemed to present that the highest and best use would, to some level, remain as redevelopment of existing usages. And
it's in the short term.
In the short term,
yeah.
Right. And so that combined with this language, we've heard pretty extensively about one specific site in this zone. But thinking about what that means for the rest of them, if the market speaks and hypothetically one site is redeveloped as residential and it's unsuccessful and there isn't an incentive or a rationale to redevelop the rest of the sites, then that's what the market determines. But I think that if we close that door after 10 years, it could be doing a disservice to that area by allowing one hypothetical site.
That is a good point. And I don't know, I don't know that I want to argue that that's a pretty reasonable account of development timeline, or like the cycle of development, even though, I don't know, we live in accelerated, freaky times.
Oh, today.
But you're giving it the long game like a developer has to. I don't know. I've been so sticking to the B option myself as far as where we've been going as a convening body for a while.
And live-work units are permitted outright as well.
It was just the standalone residential was what we were, as part of the overlay that we were.
Right, and so was live-work residential, I guess in thinking about redevelopment and, highest and best use and adding live-work units in there. I mean, I could see that trend could happen. But I guess, I think overall, I don't think that, from my opinion, we want this to turn into a residential zone.
Yeah.
So that's...
B represents to me an approach to be able to fulfill the spirit of the plan, meet goals and objectives of the NMIA, but also recognize what the mill-ins option for their viability is. So I'm not totally, I'm a little bit swayed by Commissioner Jones, but I keep coming back to the goal and objectives of the plan, and the fact that I was on the advisory committee and heard from many of the members of the advisory committee what they felt that the role and or what the NMIA is in general and its uses. I still tend to favor then the option B myself.
Yeah. Well, I will say, and I will add that if we're deliberating between option B and option C, it seems like we as a commission are more aligned or becoming more aligned with the testimony that we've heard from the experts and from the community, and that maybe the more political goal here is recommending something that council will approve.
That's
based on.
I wouldn't try to second guess them, in that sense.
Yeah.
They made a choice when they adopted it to not put residential there, but you could. I don't know where they'll go in the.
I don't either. Though
I
I feel like B, the deliberation and where we've come from is almost like we're really trying to account for the mill-in site and the owner's very tangible, real issue of their future, and that B is almost a more of a direct kind of argument that we're going back to council with. I don't know. It just feels like that's how I've come to see it with the way we framed our debate. but it is not lock solid easy, or it's not open shut for me. Except that I want the mill-end site to be able to develop, for them to be viable. Anything else?
I'm really struggling with this. I mean, I don't see a problem personally with having a greater residential use of the district on the far west side. I mean, I think we kind of somewhat arbitrarily carved out the area around the mill end side. I think we made it bigger than the mill end side, so it wasn't one, but it was just plausibly bigger enough so that it wasn't just one side. And maybe that's better than one side, but it's pretty arbitrary. I'm struck by the fact that there is not likely to be any redevelopment. We've got nice visions of glazing and street frontages and redevelopment and eco districts, but we've heard that that's not likely to happen. And in the Echo Northwest report, they talked about the opportunities to be flexible and look for what they call the unicorn development. And I think that the unicorn that's in front of us is mill end. It can plausibly redevelop. Probably nothing else will in a decade, maybe more, seems to be the analysis, but nobody knows for sure. But that seems pretty likely to me that that's credible, and there won't be any other redevelopment that makes this into an eco district or makes this into a pedestrian-friendly place. But I want to kind of respect the desire to have employment and to maintain employment. And I've been thinking through if I could start from scratch, what alternatives or how would I structure this? And we're so far down this road that I'm kind of hesitant to try and open up a can of worms. But I'm really dissatisfied with the notion of having mill end leave Milwaukie. And I'm dissatisfied with the notion of carving out an arbitrarily small chunk that's plausibly big enough to not just be mill end. And I'm really dissatisfied with the notion of presenting a plan that council's already rejected and they're likely to, reject again. So I just don't know. I'm sure that was very helpful.
Dose of reality.
Yeah.
I guess the reality that's in front of us is there's a redevelopment project that preserves jobs and introduces housing, and so I'm kind of leaning towards, by any means necessary, let's preserve those jobs and preserve that. One of the things that I think makes Milwaukie a pretty interesting place, it's before I lived in Milwaukie, I always knew Mill End, and I've been there. It brought me to Milwaukie when I lived in Portland, and 10 years ago there wasn't a lot of things to bring a person, from Portland into Milwaukie, and that's pretty cool.
It is.
Vera asked for consensus. I don't know that we're going to get it tonight on this one.
Option B.
I think B would probably likely be.
Yeah, we're not doing a proxy vote tonight, but at least we heard what we heard.
Yep.
And, I'm comfortable to say that I am still a predisposition to go with option B. That's how I'm relating this in our deliberation from my perspective. So, and that's what we all have a right to do.
I mean, how tightly do we need to craft this to get to council as a recommendation? I mean,
what we are looking for is some general policy direction so we can come back with the applicability language that describes how long this thing exists and whether or not housing continues beyond the time frame. So we sort of need policy direction to put some language together. And then, but it's, if you don't, if we'll probably come back with something similar to what we had the first time, if we don't hear something that's a lot different. Yeah. And the other thing we need to talk about is the mill end store retail use itself, and whether we open that retail, what they're looking for is the ability to redevelop the site and put in a retail use mill-end store that is larger than what we would otherwise allow, recognizing that they've got a non-conforming retail use today. We can craft language that would allow that. And my concern is that if we don't craft it tightly, we could get your typical big box in a 60,000 square foot footprint. And that is sort of the opposite of what this district was intended to try to get at. It wasn't trying to attract retail. It was trying to attract employment. So,
but there are ways around it. I mean, if you said something like products from a single source, so that would get around a lot of your. That might not prevent like a Nike town, but it would prevent a lot of the, potentially prevent a lot. So
Sure.
there are ways that staff can probably kind of get at this.
Okay.
But I agree with Denny that, and not that you're doing something that's site specific, but in some respects, I think that you've seen an opportunity that you think is worth exploring and you think the council should explore. And so whether, they'll obviously have their own questions about this and kind of come out with this with their own thought, but the tighter it is, I think as tight as it can be and meet the objectives, that's going to eliminate a lot of the other questions about collateral uses or impacts when they take a look at it.
yeah.
Yep.
So we can come back with something that we think does that. But if the commission wanted something that was wider open, that allowed other types of retail uses, you should tell us that now, or else we'll come back with something that's pretty tight. Okay.
No, I don't think.
Okay.
The other questions that were raised tonight were about whether the overlay should be exempt from the other provisions of the MTSA, the development standards, and the existing development is basically non-conforming. So I think existing development, until somebody wants to make a change, you don't have to do anything. Mm-hmm. So it's only when people want to redevelop their property in some manner that things get triggered. And that comes back to this whole triggering question about how much change before you have to do something. So I think we need to, I guess my reaction to those last couple points is I think this is, dependent on how we define redevelopment. And that if that is something that, everybody's comfortable with when we come back with the right language, that's where this issue comes into play. But other than that,
That rounded out our questions.
Did, yeah. And to be fair, I was asking that we work toward consensus, not actually reach consensus. So I think I knew where this was going to land.
so is there anything else that we should know as we go back to the drawing board and try to package this up as something that is hopefully either going to be adopted or very close to adoption at our next meeting?
Just anything we can do to provide public access and increase setbacks from Johnson Creek. We didn't talk about that today, and I just keep coming back to that as the key natural resource, one of the most important natural resources in Milwaukie, and this plan is an eco district, and I'm not sure that we're doing enough, or that we're seizing the opportunity to do more for the creek and provide access to the creek.
I think that's not so much a code issue as much as a plan issue and a project in the plan. So we can explore that and make sure
Worth
that
citing in the plan what we believe may be a objective towards.
So there are things we could do towards either incentives or requirements for greater setbacks or public access at.
Well, that we could do is some sort of incentive in the code to if we can find a way to, and something that somebody gets for giving up that access, or, yeah. Let us think about that a little bit more.
Thanks.
Well, if nothing else for deliberation, I would entertain a motion that we continue the hearing to the January 9th Planning Commission meeting.
I move to continue the hearing.
Seconded.
So moved by Commissioner Grau and seconded by Commissioner Jones. Next up is any updates?
Nope.
Okay.
Happy holidays.
Yes, for sure. As I had mentioned, our forecast for future meetings. So the third of the 3 hearings is January 9th. And then we see on January 23rd, we're taking up Milwaukie High School. Oh, yes. Okay. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
So moved by Commissioner Burns and seconded by Commissioner Grau. Thanks.